Well, hello, I'm Jane Maddocks. I was lucky enough to work at St Vincent College during the period of the Forton Lake project, the Forgotten Fleet, and I was deeply privileged also to be involved in some of the writing up and some of the research. So I'm here to present on some of the issues around Forton Lake, some of the vessels, and to actually give you an overview of what the project was, why it was important, and why citizens' involvement is still important. The Forton Lake Archaeology project is on that screen as happening just between 2006 and 2009. I find that really odd because it was a major part of my life for quite a long time. And what I'm really pleased about is that what started off as a joint project between the Nautical Archaeology Society and the Maritime Archaeology Trust, which was then Hanson White Trust for Maritime Archaeology, is now working with Citizen and is going to be available to a whole new audience. And it was an exciting project. It still is an exciting project. And I'm glad it's got new legs. Now, we call it Forton's Forgotten Fleet. That is the subtitle to the actual publication that came out much later. But when you look at the list of people who contributed, I'm not sure that it was ever a forgotten fleet. It was people who recognised that this stuff needed recording. I mean, we've obviously got the usual suspects. But even more important, we had lots and lots of individuals who gave time and energy because this project grabbed their attention. We had people who were experts in sort of ship's figureheads. And we had other people who were really good at canoes and taking images of really difficult to reach barges in the middle of the lake and shared their images with us so generously. And others who researched for us things like the MFVs, very generous with their time, very generous with their attention. And of course, we can't avoid talking about Ted Sutton, who started it all off in '96, when he decided that he was interested in these things, decided to record them, and then went to the county archaeologist with a list of the material that he'd found. And that was what inspired us to get going. So where are we? Well, south of England. That red splodge is rather a large identifier of where the site actually is, but it will do for now. It's, next stop is the Isle of Wight. But here we have what, for my mind, is a particularly important map. Now, this is from the 1760s, but if we look at that map very carefully, you will see at the bottom there is a creek, but if you look above that creek, they look like two cow horns. And if you follow the two cow horns down and to your right, you will find that that is actually Forton Creek. Now, halfway through that, there is what looks to be a line with a building on it. Now, that is a tide mill. And because it's a tide mill, if you think that the horns of the cow are sort of cut down the middle, if you look to the left of it, that was all part of the tidal pond. So when the tide came in, all that would flood up. Then they would close the gates. When the tide dropped on the seaward side, they would then open the gates and then they would be able to mill the corn or mill the grain. So what is the background then? Well, in 1949, the RAF took an aerial photo of this particular part of the lake. So you can see on your far left, there is a line coming down. That is where the mill was. It's just now a causeway. And then as you move over to the right, you can see lots of splodges or dots actually in the image. And those are the wrecks or the hulks that were parked up there at the end of the war and even earlier because there were 3 boatyards there and they were actually probably using a lot of that to recycle metals and other materials. I mean, there are quite a few things like engines, propellers, boilers, which would have been recycled because the metals were quite precious. So we had, with this background, a 4-year project, 3 years of fieldwork, and then a year of research and writing up. We have to make it quite clear that hulks were an early form of recycling because these were not wrecks. These vessels were actually brought up in a state where it was known that they were not going to be used for their initial purpose anymore, but they were going to be torn apart, taken apart, and various bits used to recycle. So it's early recycling. By the end of the 3rd year, we had identified over 30 vessels. Now, some of those identifications are still, I think, something that we need to look at. Some of them are very sound. But there are one or two interesting vessels, and one of them is the MFV, supposedly, Lauren, which I'll talk about later. So we have a slightly prettier image here. It's, I think, nice and clear because it does show you some of the most important aspects of the vessels that we were looking at. But it also does some other things, because if you look at the far left again, you're looking at the site of the tide mill. Now, because you have a tide mill there, you can't take any of the vessels that you are hulking up any further in towards what then becomes much more the top end of Gosport. You have to have those vessels actually below the tide mill because it is a barrier. But it also allows you to think about other places that are going to be important. You've got, on the far right, you've got a munitions factory. And it's always worth remembering with that munitions factory, and the bit I love about this is that actually it was meant to be in Portsmouth. But Portsmouth was so concerned about the prospect of being blown up that they decided that that privilege could be given to Gosport. So we now have Pretty's Hard, it's a munitions factory, it's in Gosport, because it doesn't matter if we get blown up. Of course, then immediately south of it, we have the Royal Clarence Yard, and that was a victualling yard. And one of the exciting things about that is that with that victualling yard, even in the 80s and 90s, when they were doing some work, because it's now a rather nice little housing place, when we were doing some of the work, we did some of the early excavation there. And we had to stop because the ground, this is a bit gruesome, but never mind, the ground was absolutely saturated with blood, because that's where they slaughtered the oxen to put in the casks to send out with the Navy. So we had to stop. So that was all right, because we then trotted off to slightly more towards the creek area, and we started excavating where we didn't think there would be blood. And we found harbour facings made of reused medieval timbers. So it's all happening there. It's still part of the story of Forton Lake, but it's not the hulks. And I will get back to the hulks in a minute. It's just that the whole point of, for me, about Forton Lake is that I had been really interested in all the other bits that surrounded Forton Lake, but looking at the Forgotten Fleet enabled me to look at something really specifically, which was a very careful use of a resource at the end of a war and earlier, and that you could associate them with other landscape features. So, there we go. There's our major community archaeology project, and that is the material that we were thinking that we were going to be working with. Soggy, smelly wood. Now that is very nice soggy, smelly wood, because actually what you have there is a very clear definition of timbers. You've got some very clear structure there. You can actually see where all the trennels have been put in, which will hold the timbers. You've got materials there which will make any maritime archaeologist go, that is a nice piece of very substantial ship. So our aims, well, a lot of people have been spending a lot of time just sort of thinking, oh, that's nice, or that's interesting, or that's a wreck, stating the obvious. But what we hadn't ever done really was to look at that resource and to start tying it in with developments in the landscape and actually the real archaeology of it. Where are the documents? Where are the maps? Can we actually trace any of this and give it some provenance? Or is it just going to be physical survey, physically putting these boats in? Can we talk to people? So what we needed to do was, we had a lot of thoughts, we had a lot of ideas, and we had a lot of images and a lot of drawings. What we needed to do was actually make them reflect what was actually in physical hard evidence, and then the documentary evidence, and then the map evidence. So that was quite a challenge. I think another challenge was that we wanted to tell people about Forton Lake because it is a very unusual place. And I think it was difficult because people just see mud and weed and green slime and smelly, stinky, petrol-y, phosphorus-y, baddy sort of footprints in the sludge, and they don't really realise what's there. And I thought for some time that it isn't just that you see a wreck, and it isn't just that you see a landscape. It's important that you identify the story, the history, or that links the landscape with the object. Because if you just look at the object in isolation, it's not exciting, it's not interesting, it's an object. If you learn about it, then it becomes interesting. So what have we achieved? Well, I think we've looked at or recovered or recorded 30 vessels. And amongst those 30, we've got wooden barges. And actually their solidity of construction is unbelievable. We have 2 ferries, both of which were very different forms of ferry. So there again, you have a class of boat with their form completely organised by their function. Some were fast ferries, one was slow ferry, one was chain ferry. We had lifeboats, interestingly both fairly modern, and it is really interesting perhaps that one of the big boats in the collection is a ferry called the Fadney, and she was very carefully designed, I think, to be just small enough so she didn't have to carry lifeboats. So we researched the archaeological development of the area, systematic appraisal of the documents, systematic appraisal of the resource, and we engaged with the local community. We had over 20 public engagement events over the 3 years. We involved the mayor, we involved the council, we involved the college, we involved anyone who wanted to be involved. And I haven't got an image of it just as well, but the day I appeared with face paints that made me look like a crab went down very well in the annals. I paid a lot of money to get that slide taken off the stuff. When I started out, there was a barrier between the archaeologist and what we'll now call the avocational. But the Forton Lake project showed me that it was artificial, because we all have a contribution if we know what we're talking about in our own field. So what was it like? Well, this gives you a clue, doesn't it? If you see the images here, you've got Paul Donoghue, and I'm very sorry, for the moment I've forgotten who is actually there with the tape. And what we're doing here is we're looking at a piece of a barge which is up in the bank, and unfortunately the tide is trying to beat us. You can just see to her left that the water is coming in. It is burying stuff that we were surveying until about half an hour beforehand. We did have to think about safety because we had a lot of youngsters on site, and as we all know, youngsters are immortal. And they would think nothing of piling into that lot and suddenly discovering that they were sinking fast and their Wellingtons were a thing of the past and they would never find them again. We only had one lost Wellington, but we had things like throwing ropes and walking mats, so we did take things quite seriously. One of the things about working with St Vincent College and them so generously letting us have buildings was that we had a lot of hot water and the ability to scrub our hands and everything else that got wet and muddy clean. I suppose what I want to do is, I'm going to be a bit self-indulgent. These are some of my favourite vessels. So I'm going to talk about my favourite vessels, if that's okay. My very favourite vessel of all is the Bombscale. Now, in the lake, fairly unprepossessing, a splodge of metal, surrounded by mud. But in her heyday, or its heyday, a bombscale would be used to take bombs out to seaplanes. Now, a seaplane is fairly low in the water, so a bombscale has to have a fairly low freeboard. So the bomb would go in to the scow, it would be driven from behind, and what it had to do is it had to slide under the wing of the seaplane so it could be hoisted up in position so it could be deployed. I think what was important here was when we actually just saw the mess that is on the right-hand side, in the mud bit, it looked a bit of a mishmash. And what eventually became important was that we drew it to scale, because by drawing it, by preparing an image that was measured accurately, that was drawn carefully, you could actually see the structure that was there quite clearly, and your eye wasn't being diverted by bits of metal who perhaps they shouldn't be. And eventually, although I haven't got a copy of that, there is an actual plan of a bombscale, and you can see that although the pencil drawing actually shows what's there now, when it was first in use, it would have had a much longer skin behind it, so it wouldn't be quite... There is a lot of it that has disappeared. And here is one. A bombscale with bombs. And I just think that is such a sleek vessel, which has such a dark purpose, that I always find this probably one of the most fascinating of all of them. She's pretty rare. It's likely there are about 4 of them left. The reason it's likely to be in Forton Lake is that we are quite close to Calshot, and Calshot did have a lot of seaplanes, and there are certainly 2 of them underwater there. I failed to actually take off for the last time. So probably my favourite vessel of all of them. And I really enjoyed surveying her, although I must stop calling her her. So anyway, let's find out what we found about Bombscale. Well, 72 were built in Dartmouth. Obviously, a bombscale, she's used to load bombs onto flying boats. As I mentioned earlier, Calshot was the centre of flying boats. There are still some underwater, which a group are actually looking at the moment. And as I said earlier, you have to have a low freeboard, because if you don't have a low freeboard, you can't get under the wing to load the bombs. It did mean actually that they had quite a reduced bomb carrying capacity. So they had a limited use. And unfortunately, this bombscale, which is FL23, her propulsion unit had been removed, and now that will probably be because it was salvageable material. It would be copper, it would be bronze, it would be steel, all of which could be reused again immediately after World War II, when things were pretty tight. Another favourite, I suppose, class of boat for me is the Minesweeper, mainly because the chat, they didn't call it a minesweeper, military minesweeper, they called it a Mickey Mouse, because it was an MMS. So I think that's rather endearing. And we have some really nice minesweepers around the country, but the one in Forton Lake is really rather good. And here she is. So if we look at this is fairly early on in her beaching. She's starting to break up on the top image. You can see that quite clearly. If you look very carefully where the man is standing, you can just see the sweeping wheel, the wire wheel. And now I'm afraid she's very different, because she's been a child's playground for years. Children love jumping around in her. You still have the wheel. She's long. She's a very heavy construction, as you would hope if you're going to go out to sweep mines. The wires themselves, which would be wrapped around the drum, they would run out quite long. And the idea was they were quite serrated, the edges were quite serrated of these wires. So if there was a mine that was coming up from the seabed, if it was an anchored mine, it would be anchored on a cable, and it would be within sort of a few metres of the surface. So if you ran this particular wire, which had really sharp edges, it would cut the tether, and then the mine would bob up to the surface, and somebody in the back would probably be able to take it off with a gun. That was the theory anyway. Unfortunately, there was a fairly high attrition rate. To have one that survived the whole war is fairly rare. With this, as much wood was used as possible, because if you have a minesweeper, you do not want a minesweeper to send out any form of magnetic signal. It counter-indicates survival, really, doesn't it? But I like these. They're very solid boats. They're very honest boats. If you can ascribe personality to boats, they did what they said on the tin. Well, this is a really self-indulgent ramble through my favourite types of vessel. And I suppose now we come to my second favourite after the scow, which is the Admiralty type MFV. And we have one, apparently, in Forton Lake. The one that's actually in the report is FL9. The image that you see in front of you is not FL9, and it is actually not an Admiralty type pattern MFV. It is an MFV from the classic motorised fishing vessel, not the Admiralty type motorised fishing vessel. So she's got all the classic MFV identifiers. She's got a nice rounded sort of back end. She has a steadying sail. She's got quite a lot of workspace up front. She has masts up front that can actually control various aspects of signalling. And her bow is a nice rounded sort of looking bow. She's also very sturdy. She's got a good structure. She will live in any sea. There's going to be very few seas with something built as strongly as that are going to overwhelm her. She's a thumping great ship made of big wood. Now, the problem with MFVs is they will live in any sea, but they will do it by rolling like a cork in a barrel. And one of the things that they will do, I came back once from the Channel Islands in one of those, and it was a force 10, and we had a beam C, and we went from gunwale to gunwale, and that means from left to right to left. She was taking water in on sides, but she floated like a cork. Everybody was sick, but she floated like a cork. And this was one of the great benefits of this type of vessel. They're immensely hardy. They will cope with amazing sea conditions. Now, in 1942, the Admiralty realised they needed patrol boats that were somewhat sturdier than normal. So they decided that they were going to produce the Admiralty type MFV, and it is a very specific type. It was built from 1942. They'd stopped building them by 1949, and they are absolutely diagnostic of their own type. So they have to be patrol boats. They have to be general workhorses. They have to be robustly built. But with the Admiralty MFV, you're looking at 4 distinctive sizes. And the distinctive sizes, about 45 foot. About, 61.5 feet. That's a bit precise for almost, isn't it? There was the 75-footer, and then there was the real biggie, which was the 90-footer. Now, most of the 90-footers probably went out to Singapore and to the Far East. A lot of the others were sturdy coastal patrol boats. Now, FL2, which is the one that we've sort of thought might be an Admiralty pattern, which is the one I'm having the query about, she is 16.60 metres long. So she would tend to fit towards the 61-footer, but she's not absolutely there. We know that part of her is distorted, so we're not sure what that's done with the measurement. And provisionally, she was identified as MFV Lauren, which was interesting because in 8 days of solid research, I failed to find any MFV called Lauren in any document anywhere. So we were wondering whether or not Lauren was, in fact, not a military pattern MFV. Her bow is wrong. She's got a lovely 1930s rounded bow. Everything else about her just shouts, yes, I am an MFV. And I think what I would like to do then is to go back and look and see whether or not we can actually see anything in the 30s that would suggest that this is our MFV. But why I wanted to include her was actually, I really like her. I really like this vessel. We still got the engine bed, we still got the mast, and we still got the rudder still present. The rudder is a total identifier for an MFV. She shrieks MFV. But there is some interesting, I suppose, I love the way that with these vessels, because of the jobs that they were going to do, they were built very robustly and their bow was really reinforced. What we have with, well, I'll call her MFV Lauren for the moment. What we have at the moment with this bow is it is very heavily reinforced with concrete bow, as you would expect, because a lot of these vessels would just be used as you drive up to a warship, take people off, take stores off, do something. And obviously, if you're going to come up to warships, it's not always going to be flat. You're probably going to knock into them. So the bow is very robust. So how they did their concrete reinforcement still makes me smile. Shells. Explosive shells. Upside down, in the concrete. Fortunately, they have been expended. They are not live. And I just thought that, you know, to me that always appeals because it's such a basically sensible way of getting rid of something that you didn't want to use anymore, but you needed something reinforced. And for me, I think that is MFV Lauren, the one with the shell cases upside down in the concrete in the bow. And you can imagine it, can't you? It's, you know, it's late at night. It's a bit rough. They roll like little rolling things, and they're coming up to a warship. They're going to unload messages or something, and you have this bow which is meant to take the odd battering. Aren't you glad the shells are dead? You know, I suppose now we're moving towards my less favourite, but more. I think they are other people's favourites, which is why I'm sort of having a quick think about them. We have a Medina ferry, and Medina ferry is a chain ferry, and what you have with a chain ferry, obviously, is chains. You have chains both sides. You have an engine on each side of the ferry, and there are hooks which grab the chains, and you progress across a harbour. You don't deviate. You can't deviate. But we have this Medina ferry, which has had quite a long and quite an exciting life. For those people involved in yacht design in the 30s and 40s, there's a chap called Arthur Fox, and he was very influential in small racing boat design. And he actually had quite an impact on the Medina ferry. So what we are looking at now with this is something which has enormous local influence, because the Medina ferry is the East Cowes, West Cowes ferry. It was working for a good few years. Once it had finished its life as the main ferry, it became a substitute ferry. And actually, I wonder whether or not they wish it was still in service as a substitute ferry, because I know they're having difficulty with the one they've got at the moment. And then Arthur Fox decided that he was going to buy it, and he decided to make some alterations. And this, I suppose, takes us to some part of her life story. Bottom left, how she is now. Not very clear, that image, particularly because it's masked by the boat behind it. But you do see that it's low. Very little of any superstructure remains at all. We have got some of the posts that would have lifted the chains. When we first started surveying her, at the end of each of those sort of side pieces, there were concertinas of card, which were actually used to baffle the noise of the chains. I think they've all gone now, but they lasted until 1995, 96. And they were still there, although in a more fragmentary condition in the 2007 excavation series. But you can see in other pictures, in the images of 1896, you can see how she would have looked with a ramp, and that you also have on each side, there would be a covered area for people to be in, and it would also cover the engines, and it would also cover the movement of the chains. The flat area in the middle would be early on for things like cattle. The days of bicycles, we're looking perhaps at very early cars, but I'm not sure how brave people would be putting their cars across on something like that. They were tended to be owned by the very rich and be very, very, very expensive. And again, top left, what you're looking at is after it had been converted to some form of workshop, and then I suppose it almost became a quasi-houseboat. It is falling apart. And really, the bottom left on that one where it says 2009, that is really what is left. And it's not masked there by any other vessels. You still have the evidence of the ramp. You still have the evidence of the bases of where the engines and where the covered area would go. You still have the area inside where the cargo would have gone, you know, the cattle, the bikes, the carriages, maybe the odd horse and carriage. It's in a pretty poor state, but it's quite important, I think, to Gosport, because it demonstrates quite clearly how something which is something in one life, as that life ends, it can become other things which still have value. And the value that it seems to have at the moment is that the local community like it. They're fond of it. It's part of the story of what they see when they're on the lake. Then we have, of course, the Great Fadney. Now, this was the Gosport to Portsmouth, so it was going across the harbour. It was quite a big thing. She was built before the Second World War, and as I mentioned earlier, she wasn't quite big enough. She didn't have enough passenger carrying capacity to be given the privilege of lifeboats. Now, this was well and truly after the Titanic. So, you know, the concept of a lifeboat for every person, or a float for every person, was fairly well understood. But it is interesting that you're looking at a social behaviour where it's okay if so many people get lost. It's not okay if one more than that gets lost. I think that's quite intriguing. She did carry out some war duties. I've yet to find out exactly what they were and where she was. And unfortunately, this is her current condition. She's, and actually, since that photograph was taken, the condition has deteriorated. One of her most important functions in the last 20 years has been as a playground for small children. They discover all sorts of climbing and jumping activities. It's not unknown for them to stand on the bow and jump into the mud. And I think one of the problems we had when we were trying to record this is that we were more concerned than their parents about whether or not there was going to be a time when we actually had to make that 999 call, because when one of them had jumped, you know, the leg had broken, or you know, they cut themselves on what was wrong on the inside. But it is part of their child heritage. It's part of their playground. And I know that this is not an archaeological way of looking at it, but it certainly is the child's way of looking at it. And once or twice we actually had to ask them if they wouldn't mind just leaving the boat for a while so we could get some tapes on it. This really tells the story, I think, that you have this rather charming ferry at the top, going between Gosport and Portsmouth, carrying people, as ferries still do. And then you have her bow shot, which I think is particularly appealing. I really like her bow shot. But we're also starting to lose her funnel. Her funnel is going. She's got great big gaping gaps in her sides now. And what is important actually about the Forton Lake project is that we can actually use the images from that as a benchmark to monitor the deterioration of a vessel of this type in this sort of environment. So it's a useful data set to move on with. And then I suppose we're looking at the ferry boat. This is Zephyr 17. And I like this because what we have in the left-hand side is all that's left of something that was very fast, actually. It's an impressive piece of kit. And if you look at her lines, you can still see the essence of something that was meant to go through the water at speed. I was going to say it's a typical RAF construction, really. Neat. Still displaying clean lines. Unfortunately, by the time you get out towards the stern, the mud is getting quite treacherous. If you look in the foreground of that illustration, you can see footmarks where somebody has taken their wellies as hopeful and tried to get round the back, but it was quite nasty actually the day we tried to do that, so we had to move away. But alongside it is what she would have looked like, although this is a different ferry boat. But you have, again, the rather beautiful bow, quite sharp. You can just see the lines that would actually make her fly across the water really well. And you can see the ferry boat, you can see the passenger carrying at the back. It wasn't meant for a lot of passengers. It would be meant for a few. But I think that, again, what this does for me, this particular vessel, it shows the importance of story. It looks pretty naff on the left. And it's only when you look at how she could have looked on the right that you start to realise that this was really a very nice, high-class piece of equipment that was designed specifically to get people from A to B quickly. I don't think the RAF ever liked to do anything slowly. And I suppose I'm finishing off really with my last people carrier. So from ferry to assault craft to a landing craft. Now, with this, what I have is that you can see a perfectly good landing craft. It's F8. You can actually go and see this particular landing craft because if you go to Portsmouth Dockyard, she's there. They would be used to carry up to 30. It's landing craft assault, so it's an LCA. And it's quite likely that the landing craft in Forton was involved in the Normandy landings because a lot of these were built specifically to prepare for the Normandy landings and to continue to deliver troops even after the initial bridgeheads were taken. Now, we know that there were several exercises before this where landing craft were used. And we know that even today, it is quite interesting because this is a functional vessel. And you look at a functional vessel, and this vessel is flat-bottomed. Its design tells you exactly what it needs to do. It has a ramp, which is up when it's travelling. It has a ramp which is down when it's unloaded. It is flat-bottomed, and it is driven from behind. So you have a ramp at one end, you have an engine or driving point at the back, because what that gives you is enough room to pack it full of soldiers who can then land on a beach, we hope reasonably fighting fit. Now, one of the problems with landing crafts is that the people who drove them, if they were soldiers, were very good at actually getting them on the damn beach before they put the ramp down. There were some who drove them who didn't want the paintwork scratched. So they would tend to put their ramp down slightly further out, which if you are a soldier jumping in with rifles and ammunition is not the best thing that could happen. And in fact, at some stage, it was really important that the landing craft assault drivers were actually instructed to get up on the beach before they dropped the ramps. And I think that's probably quite an important instruction because if you have a boat, you tend to love it, really, don't you? But in the end, I suppose we're looking at context is all. And for me, the hulks are a big part of the story, which has actually, if you like, given me a focus for realising just how important the rest of the landscape is around it. And I think there's a lot more to do there. And it's really, really interesting place to be. Fortunately, a lot of it's been recorded before it gets changed. And not unfortunately, people have to have homes, but there is such an impetus for building on old sites that I think that records that we have now are actually going to be very important in the future, because they're going to be gone. And I think we still have time to do some recording. I still think we have time to do images. I think that drones are going to be extremely useful if we can get permission to fly them. But I think what is here in this boatyard and this landscape is actually under threat. So that means I'm going to spend a good few years happily sort of crawling around brick walls and photographing lumps and bumps. That's it. Thank you.